In my 50s, I signed papers for my daughter. What happened next left us speechless. The pen clicked on the scarred wood of our dining table, a small, sharp sound in a room that had held 100 family breakfasts and 1,000 quiet reckonings. My hand rested on the paper, as if it were any other mundane thing I'd handled over the years. A grocery list, a receipt, the margin of a letter Arthur once wrote in a trembling hand. Caroline's fingers hovered at the edge of the sheet. Polite, practiced, like she was offering me a menu. Behind her, David shifted his weight from one foot to the other, an island of indecision I'd known for decades. You picture the moment as simple, a signature, an acknowledgement. People imagine giving away power with the flourish of a pen. They don't often think about what happens when someone else assumes the shape of authority and mistakes it for the sum of a life. They don't picture the ledger of dinners, the way someone remembers to oil the table before guests arrive, the little ledger of kindness and stubborn thrift that keeps a household running. I remember everything, the way lemon oil pooled in the grain and the faint smell of cut roses from the morning's bouquet. I remember the way Arthur used to hum when he sanded a piece of wood, how his hands had the same callus patterns as mine, proof that we had built things together. He had been gone less than a month, and already the house felt like an instrument someone else was tuning for a different song. If you've ever wondered why the smallest domestic gestures matter, stand in a kitchen with a person who thinks they own your name. Caroline had always moved through the world with that measured efficiency that convinces others it is kindness. She could make a casserole and a spreadsheet. She had the look of someone who could do both and expected to be asked to do them. After the funeral, that expectation hardened into insistence. For your ease, she said, to manage things. David nodded beside her, which in his case was an action that required no courage at all. Before you take my story as a simple tale of greed, know this. Caroline loved us in the way the practical love shows up, by making lists and offering solutions. But there is love that seeks stewardship, and love that seeks settlement, and those are different things. I had been the steward in our household for 30 years. I balanced the checkbook, I recalled where the insurance policy had been filed, and if an argument broke out in January over a forgotten bill, I smoothed it in March over tea and lemon thins. People called me, with affection and exasperation, the chancellor of our life. Arthur and I joked that if anything happened to both of us, the house would outlast us simply because I refused to let it dissolve into loose ends. So I signed the paper. I signed 100 things in my life, and all of them were anchored in ordinary cares. Repainting the nursery, paying the piano tuner, putting aside an envelope for rainy days. This signature, though, was a different kind of muscle memory. The paper Caroline slid across the table looked like a surrender, durable power of attorney, a thing people circle in their minds when they want to make sure someone can sign the checks or talk to banks. She smiled the exact smile she used when she intended to soothe someone into agreement. If you're watching from somewhere else, if this is the kind of story that reaches you in the middle of the night, then do me a small kindness and let me know where you are. Drop a comment below and tell me if your dining table has seen the same things mine has. I'll wait. It was after I pressed the ballpoint to the paper, but before the ink had dried, that I noticed the way Caroline's hand trembled ever so slightly. Not with fear, not quite, more like the tremor of someone who knew too well what was gained by timing. It was a rhythm I'd felt when Arthur muscled with the last of his drawings, the patient, resolute rattle before a decision. But I saw it and understood another truth. People who look competent can be very hungry. Arthur had been planning for other kinds of hunger for years. He was an architect by trade and a planner by habit. He liked to sketch things in margins, a garden bench, a side door where sunlight pooled in the late afternoon. That meticulousness was the architecture of his love. We joked about it, about his obsession with measuring twice, and our mutual agreement that the second measurement was for sentiment. One of his small private rituals had been the oak seed he carried in his coat pocket for a season. He called it a superstition, but I knew him well enough to know the superstition had a plan behind it. I'm not one for grand financial mysteries. My talents were quieter. I might sell a sapphire necklace to cover a tuition bill, or take a small loan to fix the leak in the roof. I learned to tuck things away, insurance policies in a label-stuck box, letters folded inside cookbooks, receipts in an old biscuit tin under a stack of embroidered napkins. I had a way of hiding practical things in plain sight. Arthur used to laugh and call me sly, as if I were a secret agent disguised as a seamstress. After the funeral, Caroline and David moved with a clockwork efficiency that underwrote their concern. They set up a rotating schedule, remade the voicemail greeting to a cheerful note meant for callers who assumed the obituary had changed everything. They redirected post, changed account notifications to their emails, and called the gardener with a friendlier version of me. Mrs. Vance is a little forgetful. She's asked us to handle payments for the moment. They use the language of concern and the instruments of administration. The bank put a hold on the main checking account until someone with authority could sign. The invoices that had always come to my email address began to arrive instead in Caroline's inbox. These are small maneuvers that collectively rewrite the story of a household. People think power is a single lever pulled. It is actually many small switches, each with a plausible excuse, each one adding weight. I did not panic. Panic is a useful emotion for the unprepared. It is less useful for those who have spent 30 years reading ledgers and looking for the corner where paper folds. I collected facts, like a gardener collects seeds. One minute I had a conversation with Mrs. Henderson next door about her new rose graft. The next I learned the bank had requested identification from someone who was not me. That was their first mistake. Arthur had always said, with that private smile he reserved for me at the end of dinner, that plans could be worked into the world so quietly no one noticed until they were already true. I found his letter tucked, not in a biscuit tin this time, but inside the old oak box where our keys had lived for decades. The grain of the wood felt like a map under my fingers, familiar, resistant. The envelope held a note in his small, deliberate handwriting. He called it for future storms, and beneath that line he had written 3 words that made my chest unclench: Oak Seed Trust. There are different kinds of wills. There are the hurried sentences people scribble in hospital rooms, and the layered documents that take advantage of legal technicalities meant for experts. Arthur did not leave me a scramble. He had been methodical, a quiet architect of contingencies. The envelope explained a bit, enough to show me he had thought ahead, and underneath the note, a set of instructions that were less about law and more about intent. He wanted the house to be a place of stewardship, not extraction. He wanted the boy, Leo, our small, steady-eyed grandson, to have something more than pocketed change. Leo had always been a kind of quiet light in our lives. Even small children see shapes adults miss. He spent his Saturdays in my kitchen, flour on his hands, his knees sticky with spilled jam. He would help me prune the roses and listen, really listen, when I told him about Arthur's drawings of bridges and about how houses, like people, need tending. He had an old bookmark with a pressed daisy and a drawing of a tree that looked, in the way small things do, like prophecy. When Arthur was alive, he would pull Leo onto his lap and hand-draw plans for a treehouse, the way you hand a child a secret map. The letter did not spell out every mechanism. It did something better for me. It confirmed there was a strategy I could move within. I met with Mr. Davies the next morning in his office that smelled of lemon oil and old leather. He is the sort of man who makes a desk seem like a held breath. His name appears with weight in any conversation about wills and trusts in our neighborhood. For the name, I had no hesitation. For the details, I had questions I kept short and to the point, the way Arthur would have wanted. Mr. Davies listened as if every household story were a new book. He opened a folder and slid documents across to me, as a librarian might bring a rare volume to a careful reader. He did not talk down to me. He did not marvel at the idea of an oak seed. He simply explained, in plain language and with an economy of legalese, that the thing Arthur had prepared was a way to ensure the house and its care could not simply be transferred by someone's assumption of power. The trust, he said, was designed to fund certain things and to name a beneficiary who could steward them. He said irrevocable at one point, and I felt the small, firm syllable land like a door closing against the storm. I will not turn this into a manual. I will not tell you how to set a trust. That is not my story to give. What I will tell you is that Mr. Davies' face changed in that tiny way professionals' faces change when a contingency plan fits an unusual set of facts. He admired Arthur's foresight with the same considerate private note you reserve for an elegant solution. You know how he thought, he said, and for a second I could see Arthur's bent head over a napkin sketch, the trace of a bridge. He liked to make things durable. That's the word I still think of when I think about Arthur's plans. Durable. Not flashy, not maximal, but practical and hard to undo. It was the sort of design only someone who believed in longevity could conceive. We devised a plan that felt small and right. We would let the wind blow its way through polite concern and administrative paper,
We would not meet force with force in a public way that would make our grief into a headline. I decided to move in the way Arthur had taught me, by planting seeds in soil that would sprout. I would allow Caroline to feel she had a victory, while the seed Arthur had planted could be watered until its roots took hold. In the weeks that followed, I played a careful domestic comedy. I let the conversation hang in the air as if I were tired. "I'm a bit forgetful these days," I said to neighbors, and they cooed and offered casseroles. I let Caroline take charge of the calendar, let her arrange a meeting one afternoon at my house to clarify things. People expect the elderly to shrink. That expectation is a tool, cruel when wielded, but useful in a pinch if you know how to use it without breaking yourself. There were practicalities I kept track of, like a mother with a headache and a full grocery list. I called the gardener and, with a calm voice, asked that his invoices come to me directly.
I kept receipts in plain sight on the kitchen counter, bills stacked in order, so anyone who glanced would think me a scatter of small senile boxes rather than a woman carefully assembling evidence of continuity. The bank's hold was annoying, but manageable. It was the kind of friction you smooth with patience and a steady hand. You don't fix the world in a day, I have always thought. You stitch. Caroline grew impatient in the way of those who are used to doors opening for them. She appeared at my house on a rainy Tuesday with an umbrella and a smile, and she said, "Let's just do this now, for your ease." She did not always hide her relief at being able to steer things. When someone is carrying the language of kindness like a shield, they can cut the easier. I called Mr. Davies and told him I needed a quiet day for paperwork. He did not ask why. He agreed to be present. I arranged for a notary to come by the house. Their white cart of stamps and fine print is a small theater, which put the scene into a kind of ordinary legitimacy. I cooked a pot of soup that afternoon and set 2 cups out. Domestic sounds keep a scene honest. The kettle sighing, a spoon against deep ceramic, the small clink when a pen closes and opens. I wanted everything to feel normal, because normality disarms suspicion. Before the meeting, however, there was one more discovery. I had been rummaging through Arthur's desk for a particular drafting pencil when my hand found another envelope, smaller this time, tucked behind a stack of returned postcards. The handwriting was my own, an old habit Arthur enjoyed mimicking, and the note inside was for me, as executor of his sense of the household. "Ellie," it said in his small, unshowy script, "if they come to you as heirs, let them feel their victory. They will. Let them take the pleasant sound of authority. We will not make an argument of it. It is their moment. But remember, oak takes time. Make the soil deep." There was a small packet with this note, a list of account numbers, a sketch of how payments could be moved without fuss, a line that said, plainly, that the funding of a certain instrument depended upon the signature of the primary household steward. It was not a glittering key to a vault. It was the precise mechanism of someone who had wanted to keep things whole. It required a moment in which papers were placed in ordinary hands and the right words uttered. Arthur's instructions were less about trapdoors and more about choreography. He had the patience to make a wrong thing feel right in order to let the right thing become unarguable. I felt, reading the lines by the window where the light fell like a blessing, the rush of affection and exasperation that comes with a lifetime of marriages. We had built a quiet machine to protect what we loved. When Mr. Davies arrived at my house for the meeting I had scheduled for clarification, he carried the calm of someone who has seen shoals and knows the safe passages. He had a folder and a particular pen, the kind with a heavy nib that writes as if it were making a promise. I made tea and watched his hands as he arranged the papers. There was a comfort in the ritual of signatures, the way a name curls, the pressure you apply when you mean something. Caroline arrived with a casserole and a stack of cheerful pamphlets about assisted living options she'd printed from a site that made everything look tidy. David trailed behind her, smiling as if this were a family meeting rather than a capture. They sat at the table and made small talk about the weather and about the proper course of action. The notary arrived, carrying the professional quiet of someone who had notarized many confidences. The gardener called to confirm he would be paid on Friday. My house hummed with the exact noises of people who thought they were simply doing what the situation required. There is a peculiar grace to being underestimated. People think it is humiliating. It is sometimes comic.
Caroline opened her mouth to explain procedures, to outline details. I let her. I let David add a point about efficiencies. I listened like the household steward I had always been. I placed the pen between my fingers and looked at Arthur's empty chair across the table. He would have liked the drama of it, the little theater of mundane things being rearranged. What I did not tell them, and cannot for the integrity of the plan reveal in full here, was that the paper I was about to sign was not the thing they expected. When Mr. Davies cleared his throat and said, "If you could sign here," I obliged. The movement was familiar, almost reflexive. My hand moved the way it had done 100 times before in small acts of living. A signature on a page can be many things: a transfer of power, a declaration, a closing. It can also, when placed with intention, be an activation. People often ask what it felt like to do what I did. There was a soft satisfaction, a clarity like lemon oil on the table, the sense of finishing a small task that had weight. But there was also the quiet sorrow of someone who knows that kindness can be mistaken for weakness. Arthur had taught me the patience of compounding effects, how a small seed becomes a tree if you feed it properly, and that patience felt present in my wrist as the pen reached the paper. Caroline watched me with a satisfaction that looked, briefly, like triumph. She leaned forward and smoothed a crease in her sleeve, the gesture people make when they are about to reap the consequences of their confidence. David looked relieved, in the way that a man who has stood aside his whole life looks relieved to see someone else doing a thing he has only observed. When the ink dried and the papers were stacked, Sarah, our notary, announced that the documents had been properly witnessed. It was the ritual I had prepared for: signatures, stamps, small scripted phrases that lend weight.
Outside, the rain started up again, and the roses on the porch shuddered their petals as if applauding. I did not reveal my satisfaction. I smiled and thanked them for their help. We agreed on a few administrative matters, and then Caroline left with the pamphlets and an air of quiet success. David paused at the door and kissed my forehead, as if apologizing for what he felt he had to do. He said, "We're just trying to make sure you're taken care of," and I believed, as always, that he meant it in the way he could. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, folding napkins and counting the small, satisfying inventory of my home, I allowed myself one honest breath of triumph that felt more like relief. There is a difference between revenge and justice. I had not wanted every eye to watch this moment, to feel like I was out for spectacle. I wanted protection. I wanted to pass stewardship, without spectacle, to the one who would honor it. There was still work to be done. Tending an oak takes seasons. That, in part, is the point Arthur had always loved. The next days were a flurry of small acts: phone calls to confirm things, a trip to the bank to ensure the paperwork was in proper order, a brief visit to the gardener to remind him where invoices should go. Each action felt like a stitch in a long seam. I kept records in a manner that would appear disorganized to a quick glance, but sensible and traceable to anyone who knew what to look for. Caroline was not without moves of her own. She called me the day after to ask if I would reconsider having her name on an account for convenience. She phrased it as practicality. "It's easier if I can just pay some of the monthly bills," she said. Her voice had the polite impatience of someone who expects doors to be opened. I let her talk, and I let my voice stay even. "I'm grateful," I said, "but I think the arrangements we made today will handle what we need." There was a pause on the line, the small silence that reveals a person recalibrating their plan. "Of course," she said finally. "I just want you to be okay." When the call ended, I walked out to the garden. The roses needed pruning. Leo was there, sitting on the little stone bench we had placed by the apple tree, watching me. He had a smudge of dirt on his chin, and a look of solemnity that makes small children seem older than they are. He handed me a small acorn he had found earlier, his fingers holding it like a promise. "You keep them," I told him, taking the acorn and tucking it into my palm. "We'll plant them, and they'll be trees for the next people to sit under." He nodded, as if he understood the economy of patience. "Will it be for me?" he asked. "For you," I said, "and not just for you, for anyone who tends it." He leaned his head against my shoulder, and I felt the soft, steady heartbeat of the future in the crook of his neck. There were, of course, unknowns. You never get to see all the corners of how a plan will unfold.
People who work in the tidy lines of policy will tell you there is always something that doesn't go according to plan. The truth is, Life is messy, in the way gardens are messy. There are thorns, and sometimes a shrub dies unexpectedly, but you keep planting. In the days that followed the meeting, as I set the house to rights, an odd thing happened. People began to speak in our living room in tones that presumed more knowledge than they'd had. The gardener mentioned, in a voice meant for my ears, that Caroline had asked him to increase his frequency. The bank called to confirm identification for a transfer and used phrasing I recognized as the language of someone testing for assumption. In other words, they were making mistakes. You learn to collect mistakes the way other people collect stamps. They are proof. The bank's phrasing, the gardener's offhand remarks, a misread invoice, all of them lined up like beads on a string. I filed them where they would be most useful, in my memory and in a small binder labeled household papers. When I open that binder now, I smell the lemon oil and faintly the graphite of Arthur's pencil. It holds things that will, if needed, demonstrate a pattern. Caroline's moves escalated in subtlety. She began to question our choices in front of guests, to suggest that perhaps we should sell a little of the property to make things simpler. David, who could never choose between anger and comfort, oscillated in the manner of one who wants to be loved and is afraid of losing it. He started asking me to consider assisted living brochures, to think about what was best for my stage of life, and he did it in the same voice as when he asked me to taste a new recipe. It was that casual, that plausible. There is a terrible effectiveness to being plausible. It obscures intent with a bland, practical look. But a plan will reveal itself. People tip their hands. One afternoon, Mr. Davies called to say there were a few loose ends to tie up. He sounded as if the world had been slightly made better by paperwork. "We can proceed," he said simply. I let him proceed. As I arranged the dining table that afternoon, laying out the napkins and smoothing out crumbs as if preparing for a small, ordinary meal, I felt a strange serenity. This is the oddest part. Protection felt domestic. It felt like lemon oil and rose pruning and counting the teaspoons at the back of the drawer. When people ask me what it is like to wrestle against an entitled child, I tell them that the victory is not in their public collapse, but in the small rearrangements that make theft impossible. We had not yet reached that collapse. There were still choices to be made, small tests to pass. Caroline would schedule another meeting, and David would show up with a confession of sorts, all fogged with good intentions. Mr. Davies would be there quietly, like a hinge. I organized that meeting in my mind like a recipe, the ingredients placed just so.
I knew I could not control everything. That is not how stewardship works. But I could control the table settings. On the morning before the next meeting, I did a thing that felt almost ceremonial. I set the table with the linen Arthur had liked, the napkins embroidered by my mother. At each place I put a small peony that had survived the frost. I placed, not with ostentation, but with intent, a single sealed envelope beneath my plate. It was not the only piece of paper in the house that had power that day, but it was the one that felt the most like a seed. Leo came in to help me. He smelled of cut grass and the kind of small reckoning that comes with being 8 years old and already understanding you are part of something larger. He asked why I had an envelope at my place. I told him, in the way you tell a child a story without revealing the plot, that some things are meant to be hidden until they are ready to grow. Like seeds, he asked. Exactly like seeds, I said. You don't plant them by shouting about them. You put them in the ground and you water them and you wait. He nodded solemnly, and I felt a happiness so deep it almost hurt. Arthur would have laughed at my dramatics, but he would have been pleased too. We had always liked to turn simple acts into small rituals. When we were young and short of money, we would set the table as if we were hosting royals, because the dignity of adolescence cannot survive without ceremony. I left the envelope where it was and made the soup for the meeting. When Caroline arrived that afternoon with that particular smile, she did not notice the envelope beneath my plate. She never noticed the small things when their visibility did not serve her. She was too busy rehearsing her next administrative move. David made a joke about the weather and no one laughed, because in that moment, everyone was listening. We took our seats. The notary, the lawyer, the soft hum of the refrigerator. Each was a member of the cast, witnesses to the quiet theater of family. I poured tea and offered everyone a cup. I felt content. There was no sound like that of finality yet, only the measured steps of preparation.
Outside, Leo sat in the garden and traced the edge of a stone with one finger, as if practicing patience. When Mr. Davies opened his folder and slid a single page toward me, insisting we read aloud what we were about to sign, I felt a small, private thrill. His voice was steady. Caroline's was too. David's, less so. They read the lines as if the words were capable of rendering the world simple. The power of paperwork is not in its ink, however. It is in the intent the ink carries. Arthur had known that. Arthur had designed the intent to be quietly unassailable. There was no grand battle in that room. There was instead the sound of pens uncapping, the gentle mutter of a notary confirming identity, the small whisper of paper. If you have watched those moments before, you know they are both ordinary and dangerous.
I signed once. The ink spread like a promise. Then I sat back, and for a beat, everyone looked satisfied. It was a delicate performance. The next movements would determine whether my plan bore fruit. I set the table to be witnessed, not to be taken for granted. I had planted my seed and tended the soil. In the end, that is what stewardship feels like. Not spectacle, not vengeance, but the slow work of making sure that when the rain comes, the right things have roots. The rest of the story depends on what happens at that table in the minutes after the ink is dry. I do not tell it as triumph or as tragedy at this point. I tell it as preparation. There are still letters to be opened, conversations to be had, and a child with sticky fingers waiting by the apple tree to whom a legacy should be entrusted. The house waits, like a patient animal, for the next footsteps. I walked out afterward to the garden, where Leo handed me back the acorn and we planted it in a small patch of soil by the apple tree. The ground accepted it without fuss. The sky was a clean gray that promised rain, and with it the chance for something to grow. Inside, on the dining table, the ink had dried, and beneath my plate the envelope waited. The next day would decide whether it had been enough. The morning after I planted the acorn, the house felt as if it were breathing differently, deeper, patient. The envelope beneath my plate had the same stillness as the soil where Leo and I had tucked that little seed. I made coffee and let the steam fog the kitchen window while the rain rinsed the slate path. There were a few small, ordinary tasks to do. Ring the gardener to confirm Friday's payment, sweep the crumbs from the sideboard, straighten the stack of magazines on the hall table. Ordinary things keep the world honest. Mr. Davies arrived with a soft knock and the quiet that had become his calling card. He put his hat on the rack, hung his coat on the peg behind the door, and sat at the table like a man who had come to pray. He opened his folder with the same gentle efficiency he always used and slid a single sheet across toward me. His eyes found mine and held them like a conversation. "Mrs. Vance," he said, and folded his hands as if completing a prayer. "There's one final matter to address. Formal confirmation of the instrument Arthur and I put in place." Caroline breezed in carrying a tote of freshly ironed shirts, smiling a little too wide for the weather. David followed behind her, polite, hovering in the doorway as if reluctant to cross. The notary took her place, an air of professional discretion already settling into the room. For a moment the house returned to its ordinary cadence. The kettle sighed, the rooster from the farm down the lane announced a late crow. The linens on the table whispered. Mr. Davies tapped the page. "If you would, Ellie, if you'd sign here and here," he said, pointing to a line that looked as humble as any signature line.
I blessedly understood the choreography. I took the pen and moved my hand where people expected. The ink settled like a small promise. He folded his hands again and looked up at Caroline. "Mrs. Vance, you've just funded an instrument Mr. Vance prepared. The document Mrs. Vance has signed this afternoon is the final funding declaration for the Oakseed Trust." Caroline smiled, because triumph is more comfortable to wear than incredulity. "Good, so that means I can—" she began. "And it's irrevocable," Mr. Davies said, the word he had used once before landing now with the gravity of a bell. He let it hang in the air like a shutter closing against wind. Caroline's smile faltered as if someone had loosened a stitch. "It names a beneficiary," he continued. "Specifically, it names Leo as the primary beneficiary and steward of the assets designated for the house and its care." There was a pause so complete, the clock on the mantelboard seemed to stop out of respect. In that pause, I could hear the memory of Arthur's pencil scratching plans, the echo of his laughter when we turned small acts into ritual. I felt a rush of warmth at the reveal, not the hotness of glee, but the quiet, steady heat of something set right. Caroline's face went through the same sequence I had seen in other people over the weeks: denial, confusion, then a brittle indignation. "That can't be," she said, though the sentences leaked uncertainty.
What is this? Leo is a child. He can't...
He is not a child in terms of intent, Mr. Davies answered evenly. Mr. Vance's instructions are clear. The trust is properly funded, and its terms make provision for stewardship, care, and maintenance. The instruments aren't ambiguous. She tricked me, Caroline said suddenly, her voice dropping into a note that was almost a confession. You put that paper in front of her. She signed... You signed what you intended to sign, Mr. Davies interrupted gently. Mrs. Vance's signature activated what Mr. Vance intended to activate. The mechanism required the steward's signature. Arthur planned for the person who actually ran the household to be the one whose assent meant something practical, who would, by ordinary acts, fund the instrument. It was as if he had read the note from the oak box aloud. Caroline's lips pressed together. David, who had preferred being a spectator to being cast in a role, made the sound he always made when he was uncomfortable, half cough, half apology. The notary glanced down at her logbook as if to check that the morning had indeed unfolded in a manner consistent with professional duty. You can't do this, Caroline said, but the force of the sentence drained into the wood grain of the table. She had been expecting the paperwork to be a key that unlocked doors. Instead, the key had been used in a lock none of them knew existed, and it remained still. I kept my voice even. You wanted control, I said. You had the papers. You had the bank.
You had the invoices coming to your inbox. Her face snapped at that, a long-held composition cracking. I was trying to look after you, she protested. You were working toward owning us, I said softly. There's a difference. Caroline stood up so quickly the chair scraped the floor. For a moment I feared she'd make a scene, throw down her pamphlets, shout, call people in from the street. Instead, she walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the cool glass, and watched a bluebird skid across the fence. She did not turn when she spoke. He left a child and a house to a grandson, she said. He made a spectacle of us in our own home. Arthur didn't want spectacle, Mr. Davies said. He wanted durability. He wanted the house cared for. The house is ours, Caroline said, and the claim had the wildness of someone who had rehearsed it. He had no right. Mr. Davies put out his hand like an apology and a shield at once. We are not here to fight in public, he said. We will proceed with the dignity Mr. Vance intended. If you have concerns about legal standing, you may of course seek counsel, but understand that the instrument is irrevocable and that the funding has been completed as of this date. Those words, irrevocable and funding has been completed, fell like a small, definitive tolling. I watched Caroline's face blanch, the color draining like ink into a blot. David shuffled his feet and looked at me as if waiting for instruction. He had, I think, expected applause. What does Leo know? Caroline snapped suddenly, pain sharp at the edge of the accusation. Did you tell him he's part of this? Did you tell him he gets everything? I thought of Leo on the garden bench, the dirt on his chin, the pressed daisy in his sock. He had sat for hours listening to people talk about the shape of things, and he had learned to hold the quiet like a skill. He knows we planted an acorn, I said. He knows a tree takes time. That's not an answer, Caroline said. He's a child. This is irresponsible. You're free to be concerned, Mr. Davies said, but the instrument sets provisions for competent stewardship. Mr. Vance's wishes are specific. He wanted the house to be cared for, not parceled out. He folded his hands and looked at me. Mrs. Vance, if you wish, we can make arrangements now for the practical steps of ensuring ongoing management as you envision. I felt my throat tighten. There was always a cost to speaking plainly to family. The day's small victory had a shadow, the sorrow of seeing the face of my child collapse quietly under the weight of a plan she had not foreseen. Still, I kept steady. That's what I want, I said. I want the house to be a place that stands, not because we hoarded it, but because someone tends it. Caroline's breath hitched. Less anger now, more something like grief. You're choosing him over me? She asked, and the old, raw child in a conflict voice crept back through the adult one.
It was a voice I knew, the one who had always wanted to be chosen first. I'm choosing the work Arthur and I did, I said. I'm choosing the life that made the work possible. For a moment, the room hung between them, 2 generations of women's claims made of different materials. Caroline's fists unclenched and then clenched again. She left without much ceremony, catching her tote and brushing past David without meeting him. He followed, lingering at the door, hesitating as if unsure whether to step into the rain or return to the safety of the kitchen.
After they left, the room felt emptier, but truer. Mr. Davies closed his folder and placed it gently into his briefcase. He looked at me with something that was no longer quite professional calm, but a kind of human relief. Arthur left very little room for ambiguity, he said, and I felt the warmth of grief wreathe into gratitude. The weeks that followed were quieter than the day of the reveal, but no less consequential. People in town began to murmur. The gardener, in the way of men who believe in practical detail, made a point to call and ask whether he should continue as before. Mrs. Henderson came by with a lemon bundt cake and sat in the parlor knitting like it was a prayer. The bank sent ordinary letters confirming receipt of documentation. I placed those letters in the binder labeled household papers. The smell of lemon oil seemed stronger on those afternoons, as though the house itself had drawn a deep, clean breath. Caroline moved through stages. At first there was shock and anger. Her trust, the quiet assumption that she would be the one to rearrange our lives, had been an expectation she thought unassailable. Then came something like bargaining, requests to be involved in the garden's redesign, suggested names for people to serve on committees. She called with offers of help that came coded with petitions. Over time, slowly, not like a switch but like a gradual turning, there were pauses on calls that sounded more reflective than combative. David, for his part, kept a distance that was not cold but prudent. He sent short emails asking after small things, a bill he could pay, a prescription he would collect. One afternoon, he came to sit with me in the kitchen while I sorted through a stack of Arthur's drawings. He rubbed his hands together as if he were going to say something courageous, and then smiled like someone who had chosen to withhold a small weapon. I was wrong, he told me simply. I thought I was doing the right thing. You thought you were protecting me, I said. And I thought it meant giving up control to people who would keep us safe, he paused. I didn't know how to be anything but useful. You were useful, I answered. You were honest about what you could do. That matters. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. There are small reparations, like paying a forgotten bill or fixing a window latch, that are not grand gestures, but they are stitches that mend.
The real reckoning came not from the family, but from a quiet trial of patience. There were small attempts at arbitration, phone calls from lawyers with the sort of careful politeness that seeks to find a crevice in a stone, a letter suggesting mediation. Mr. Davies handled each one with his characteristic mixture of stubbornness and civility. The instrument is clear, he would write, his pen steady. Mr. Vance prepared for the situation he feared most, the conversion of stewardship into seizure. He made a decision about the future. We are simply honoring it. It would have been easy in some ways to make this public. There are plenty of people who think family disputes are delicious to watch when served with a side of scandal. I never wanted that. The point of Arthur's plan was not to punish but to protect, and spectacle would have undone the careful dignity of his design. So I let the colleagues of the lawyers speak their measured lines and trusted the quiet administrative processes to do their work. When the bank confirmed that the trust accounted for the assets as described, I felt that same small domestic triumph again. A letter, a stamp, a clerk's polite notation. Leo, bless him, understood what he needed to understand and no more. He asked questions of a kind only children think to ask. Why can't Caroline plant something too? Do I have to water the roses every day? I answered him with the same simplicity I used when showing him how to clean a bird feeder. You'll have help, I said. You'll have people who love the work. The point is to do it with care. One afternoon, months after the signing, Caroline came by unannounced. She stood on the path looking as if she had rehearsed this entrance a dozen times and found each rehearsal inadequate. She was not smiling. She had the look of someone who had been crying and had only now found the courage to wipe her face. May I come in? She asked. I let her. It was not a kindness in the soft sense of indulgence. It was simply an acknowledgement that the house would continue to be a house whether we invited her in or not, and I wanted the thresholds to remain as thresholds should, open, sometimes cautiously, but open. She sat at the table with her coat still on. For a long time she did not speak. The kettle clicked and sang in the background like a metronome. Finally she said, You were always the chancellor. You always managed everything. I thought I could do it better. You thought you could do it differently, I corrected. She laughed without amusement. There's a difference, isn't there? There is. I folded a napkin into a neat square, as if making a small wordless offering. But the house isn't a prize to be won. It's a charge. She met my eyes, and in them I saw the child I had once smoothed hair from, a person who had learned to make lists because lists are a kind of safety. I didn't know how to ask for a place in that charge, she said.
I thought if I took control, I could keep what I loved. And if you had, I asked, would the love have stayed? She looked at her hands. I don't know. You can still be part of tending, I said. You can come and help prune. You can make a casserole when it's soup season. You can teach Leo to set the table properly when he is old enough. There are places for all those things. She swallowed and nodded. The movement was small and imperfect, but it was there, an offering of something other than entitlement. We did not reconcile in a way that erased the years of assumption. Reconciliation, like gardening, is a slow work. But she left that day lighter than she had come, and over the months she did come by more often, not to manage the accounts, but to bring a tart or to sit on the porch and tell a story. She learned in her own way to see stewardship as practice, not possession. The truth is, the Oak Seed Trust did what it was meant to do. It made the taking of a house and life difficult for anyone who would treat it as a prize. It made stewardship the overriding frame. It also gave Leo a burden that is beautiful and heavy in equal measure. He would inherit not just money, but responsibility. To keep the oaks tended, to hire the gardener in good times and bad, to ensure the house stayed a place where people were fed and listened to. He would have Mr. Davies' careful guidance and the help of a community that had rallies around the idea of this place as more than an asset. I taught him to measure things the way Arthur had taught me, twice for the sake of precision, and once more because you cannot help the heart from weighing in. He learned how to oil the table until the wood took on a warm sheen. He learned that ledger books were not instruments of power, but of memory. We would sit together in the dusk, and he would ask me questions about the places Arthur had designed in the margins of those old sketchbooks. He had a way of seeing how lines became shelter, of imagining how a roof could hold a family through a storm. Years have a way of making the small things large. The acorn we planted that rainy day put down a beginning. It was a beginning that did not announce itself in trumpets. It grew quietly, a root first and then a shoot, a green suggestion against the gray. Neighbors would come by and remark how nice the sapling looked, and I would smile without telling them the whole story. Some things are kinder left as mysteries. Mr. Davies continued to visit. He would come with a parcel of papers and a look that read like steady friendship. He would sometimes sit in the kitchen and tell stories about Arthur's careful designs, laughing at small absurdities as if remembrance were a way of continuing friendship. He taught Leo that documents are not just ink and seal, but a way of holding promises to future hands. On long, bright afternoons, Leo and I practiced the ritual of the table.
We would lay forks and knives with Arthur's precise spacing, brush crumbs into the palm of our hands as if one could hand the past neatly into a napkin. He would ask about the people in the photographs, friends long gone, and I would tell him stories about the way Arthur loved the way light hit the dining room in late November. People sometimes ask whether I felt vindictive when the trust was revealed. The answer is no. There was no gloating. There was instead a deep relief. Relief that the life Arthur and I had built would not be undone in a season of grief. Relief that a small boy who loved jam on his fingers would inherit a place where generosity was part of the bricks. Relief that stewardship, not seizure, would be our inheritance. Not every wound healed. Not every relationship mended to the point of being what it once was. But what I care about most is the work done and the work to come. There's a dignity in that, a modest, undeniable worth. One late summer afternoon, years after the signing, Leo and I stood in front of the small sapling. It had grown taller than his shoulder. He ran his hand along the trunk like someone remembering the lines of a hymn. We both knelt and placed a small wooden stake beside it, an act of promise rather than ownership. "Will it be big like the ones Grandpa drew?" he asked, eyes earnest and not yet weighed by the world's constants. "It will be," I said, "if we water it and tend it and keep it safe." I handed him a little tin of lemon oil and a soft rag. "And when it grows enough, you'll find it's easier to shade people than to hold them at arm's length." He looked at me, puzzled and slowly understanding. "Is that why you made the trust?" "It's one reason," I said. "It's a way of making sure the house stays a house. It's a way of teaching you that some things are not for taking, but for giving back." He nodded, solemn as a small magistrate, and began to polish a knot on the bench Arthur had once sanded smooth. The sun came down like a blessing of ordinary gold. A bird landed on the fence and sang as if the world were simply what it was meant to be, noisy, complicated, full of small kindnesses. There are days when I walk through the rooms of this house and I still feel the weight of decisions made and the ease of ones kept.
I look at the ledger of receipts in the binder, and I smile at the small domestic courage it took to keep things in order. I watch Leo arrange his school books on the study shelf with the same careful alignment Arthur used to give to his paper pads, and I feel a peace that is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of tending. The signature that afternoon in my 50s did not feel like a surrender. It felt like the last step in a long practice of care, a pen placed where a life had been measured, a mark that made an intention legible.
Miss Davies's words that day, when he said the trust was funded and irrevocable and named the one who would steward it, left us silent, not because we were defeated, but because we were faced with the reality the plan had been trying to secure, a future that would not be lost to convenience. If there is a lesson in all this, it is small and domestic. Plan with generosity. Protect what you love without making the protection a weapon. Teach the next ones how to tend the soil. It may not be dramatic. It may not be newsworthy. It will, however, be durable. If this story has touched you in any way, tell me where you're watching from. Leave a comment. Say hello. I read them all. And if you'd like to hear other stories about ordinary people doing quiet, stubborn things to preserve what matters, please subscribe. It helps more stories find their way to the ears that need them. I keep a small bottle of lemon oil by the sink and a draft of Arthur's bridge sketches in a drawer. Leo comes by in the evenings and practices the way a hinge sounds when you oil it properly. We are not perfect. We have arguments and slow reconciliations, dishes that break and doors that stick. But the house is still a place where people are fed, where stories are kept, where a child learns the economy of patience. Sometimes, when I sit at the dining table and look at the scarred grain where a pen once clicked, I close my eyes and imagine a day when the sapling will shade grandchildren who will not know the moment of worry that once shook our small world. That thought is a comfort. It is the sound of a promise kept, quiet, steady, like lemon oil on wood, and that is enough.